Good morning, everybody, and welcome to Sigma-HSE's webinar for this month, where we'll be covering the topic of how to construct a proactive and reactive process safety management strategy. Okay, so I'm Andrew Fowler. So I'm currently the Technical and Operations Director here in our headquarters in Winchester, and you can see from my little slide here, I've been in process safety literally the whole of my career in one way, shape or another. And I'm getting on in years, so I'm now in my 40th year of doing process safety. So hopefully I should have learned something by now. And the aim of today is to pass some of that knowledge on to yourselves to help you. Now, process safety, well, just let me first of all give you a brief introduction to Sigma-HSE. We've got a global presence. We're headquartered in Winchester in the UK in the south of England, but we've also got operations in India and in the northeast of the US. And we've also, so that's where we carry out most of our consultancy work, but we also have the luxury of laboratories based both in Winchester and in India, where we can investigate the flammable and explosive properties of materials. Okay, so we're a global thing. What do? We try and pass that consultancy service on to our clients to get appropriate engineering solutions, and that can either be from a hardware point of view or from a management systems point of view. And we've also got the laboratories, which are accredited laboratories to known standards. So we apply the correct and appropriate standards for the testing that we do, backed by the quality management system. And we also carry out training, bespoke training for clients on various topics. So just to put a bit more meat on those bones, in terms of laboratory testing, as I said, we can do chemical reaction hazard testing. In fact, we've actually only in the past few months got a new calorimeter, so we can do adiabatic calorimetry. So we can really start to get to understand chemical reactions and any hazards that are developed through pressure or temperature, runaways, decompositions, these sorts of things. We can determine the flammable and explosive properties of gases, vapors and combustible powders, and we're also expert in electrostatic properties, so we can measure the electrostatic properties of materials and give guidance from that point of view. From the consultancy services point of view, well, we're a process safety management consultancy, so all the things you'd expect us to be able to do, we can do, whether that's developing process safety management systems, almost the nuts of what we'll be talking about today in this webinar, reviewing those for clients, carrying out DESIR assessments or ATEX assessments, fire and explosibility issues there, undertaking many of the different types of risk assessments and hazard identification tools that are out there, HAZOP, LOPA, so on and so forth. Okay, so lots of things we've got a handle on, but when we look at process safety is it's a very specific topic, although it's been around for a long time, really. But it's more than just looking at the hazards involved in our processes. When you look at the definition of process safety, it's talking about significant hazards. It's talking about large fires, large explosions, large toxic releases, things that can do a lot of harm. Could result in multiple fatalities, for instance, many injuries, both on site and particularly off-site, where we can harm or kill the public. And of course, if we get into doing that, of course, it can have a big impact on the business. One of the problems with process safety, of course, is we don't have these big events very often. They do occur, they occur annually in one way, shape or another, but they are very unlikely events, really. And of course, this can have an impact then on how you operate as a business when you're considering your process safety management, because there's a lot involved in trying to prevent these large hazard events. An awful lot involved, and it can become very complex very quickly. And it's a lot of effort for something that, for all intents and purposes, most of us can go through our working lives in the industry and not come across one of these big events because they are rare. So it's all too easy to sort of almost forget about process safety and managing it appropriately. But if it does occur, it can be extremely serious in terms of its impacts, whether that's to the business or to people or indeed to the environment. Okay, so it's worth setting out, where the legislation is concerned. For example, the Seveso directives in Europe, and the OSHA PSM standards in the States, and the COMA legislation in the UK, which fulfills the Seveso directive, even though we've now left Europe during our Brexit exercises. You'll find when you look at the legislation, large hazards are associated with dangerous substances. So clearly there's a link with the amount of hazardous material that you have on your site. There's a difference between having a fire involving a litre of a highly flammable liquid and having a fire involving 50,000 tonnes of a flammable liquid, for example. Yeah, there's a difference of having a whiff of ammonia or catastrophic failure of ammonia system that perhaps holds 50 tonnes. So that's the focus of process safety. Okay, but as I said before, it can result in these big hazards, but they're very unlikely to occur. But it's important that we manage it appropriately, and that's what the contents of this webinar are going to take you through. So what I'll be covering is, what is a process safety strategy? Why do we need it? How to implement that strategy? And then we'll look at how we can actually manage the hazards and risks within our process safety management system. And essentially that means if we do the proper job, if we know what we're doing, if we have the correct equipment, if we operate it and maintain it appropriately and things, then when called upon to prevent these incidents or control or mitigate them, then the measures that we've put in place will be effective. So it won't be as bad as it could be because we've put measures in place. Now, when we look at developing a strategy, this is what hopefully you'll get from this thing of why it's critically important that you should have this strategy and implement it well, and why it's necessary to have an holistic system. Okay, and I'll touch on this in just a couple of minutes, but it's important to realize that whenever we talk about a strategy, we're talking about leadership. Nothing really happens unless leadership makes it happen. The top of the shop in an organization makes this happen. And this was clearly indicated following the BP Texas City event back in 2005, and in fact the Buncefield event in the UK, where the reports after the investigations made it very clear that one of the major things that was lacking in process safety was this clear and positive process safety leadership. It's all too easy to think it won't happen to us because these things are so rare, and therefore we take our eyes off the ball because we're busy doing other things, making money for the business and so on and so forth. But these investigations clearly showed that process safety leadership wasn't there, that there wasn't board level involvement or any competence at board level in this subject. And they didn't go out and they didn't change the situation. They didn't produce what was called a positive process safety culture, giving that focus, setting the business up to actually look at it. Now, there's two, I've mentioned one reason for perhaps not managing it as well as we should do, and that's because of the likelihood of these large events, these really catastrophic events. But another reason is process safety isn't just engineering. It's often thought that, we leave this topic to our technical experts in the business. And yes, there's a lot of technical things within process safety. There's a lot of robust methodologies used, which have been out there for a lot of years, and most people know about them. But of course, there's human involvement. We've got to have that commitment to do the right thing in the first place, and to make sure that we set ourselves up as a business to manage this appropriately. Because if we don't manage it appropriately and we have these major accident hazards, we have a large release of a flammable material or a toxic material, the harm that can do, even if it doesn't kill anybody, you're going to get yourself on the news, and that can happen very quickly these days, globally. So you'll get the sort of knowledge of your company name throughout the world very quickly because you've had some large disaster. Okay, so it's important that the leadership sets this commitment to do the right thing, to make sure that it is on the agenda and it is dealt with appropriately. And really, we need to take a holistic approach. It isn't just the technicalities of it. I often think process safety is like a bag of spaghetti. We've got all of these things that we must do properly to manage, so we can prevent these sorts of events. And what we try to do, we need to try and untangle that bag of spaghetti and see the linkages between everything that the technical people do, the management system does, the leadership does, and everything else. Okay. Now, leaders are important. I've pulled out leaders as very important for setting this strategy, because leaders are important people. We tend to act on what the leaders want us to do. They need to set that roadmap. They need to set that aim, that vision for the business going forward, which is clearly obvious. No business wants to kill people. No business wants to get itself onto the news because it's had a disaster. It's obvious, okay? But we need to look, because it's rare, we still need to do, because these incidents are rare, we still need to put this effort in. And that's what I mean by this looking for value maximization. It's to do with sustainability of the business rather than shorter term profit maximization. Yeah. And if we do it well, if the leaders do get a grip of this and make it happen, there's a real opportunity for them to influence the performance of the business. But it requires them setting this strategic vision. Where do they want to be? What do they need to do? And obviously give appropriate resources and everything else, which, if you're in process safety land, the amount of resources that you need to do this job properly is very large, quite significant. Okay. Now, I differentiate the management, the leaders, from management, which is less granular, and they're doing tactical things really, and dealing with things over an annual basis on the whole. Whereas we need the leadership will set this vision. It's an extremely important thing to do. It's changing the culture of the business. Okay. So what do I mean by the culture of the business? You know, when we look out there, if I pull up the health and safety executive's guidance on what a safety culture is, it gives this quite wordy definition of health and safety, which is nothing wrong with it, but obviously it's quite a bureaucratic statement, the product of individual and group values, attitudes, competencies and patterns of behaviour that determine the commitment to and the style and proficiency of its organisation's health and safety programmes. Okay, I like to think of it simply as how's the organisation behave when nobody's watching? When we don't have an auditor in, are we still doing the correct things? Yeah, on the night shift, do they still do the job properly? Do we fulfil what's laid down within our management system in the ways that we expect to work and what's expected from the organisation? But culture's one of these funny sort of ethereal concepts, really. We all know culture, but what makes a culture? What makes a sound process safety culture? Well, basically, the outcomes from it are the attitudes and the behaviour of the staff. What we basically need to do in process safety, because the outcomes, if we get it wrong, can be so severe, then we need to make sure that we do things that are critical to prevent, control or mitigate these bad things from happening. They need to be treated in the right way, which pulls down into the behaviour and attitudes of people and indeed the business of doing the right thing, this commitment about doing the right thing. Okay. And what you'll find in practice is if you've got a sound process safety culture, you'll start hearing people talking about process safety. It'll be, up there as one of the major things that keeps them busy and keeps them talking and knowing where the gaps are, the things that need to be improved and so on and so forth. And they'll fetch those forward. Okay. It's very much like if I turn away from process safety for a minute and look at occupational safety. It wasn't too long ago, perhaps 50 years ago, where occupational safety, we were killing people doing simple things, slipping, tripping, falling off things, having things falling on them. Okay. When I joined the industry back in the early 80s, you were pulling people up because they weren't wearing the correct PPE or they weren't using the right equipment for jobs and things like that. Now, because of an awful lot of effort from the leadership of changing the behaviours and changing the attitudes, occupational safety now doesn't result in that many fatalities, nowhere near as many as it used to do. And that's because we've put the effort in and we've got good at it. And we've seen it. We've seen fatal accident rates decrease over time and they're now bobbing along at a very low rate. That's because we've put the effort in. But these, changing behaviours and changing attitudes are outcomes. What do you need to do on the input side to make sure that we change these behaviours and attitudes within the business of doing the right thing, of having that commitment to doing the right thing? And what this slide illustrates is the three things that are needed to be able to change those behaviours and attitudes and end up with the correct culture that's needed. What we need are tangible targets and objectives set from the top as to what it is the business is trying to achieve. Then we have the appropriate systems and procedures to guide us in what we need to do things properly. And then we've got the most important thing, and the thing that is lacking in most organizations is this constant coaching and mentoring, looking for the good, fixing the bad, finding the gaps, discussing things, making things happen. Yeah, it's changing these attitudes. And I think perhaps the best way I can example I can give of that is, you know, if you think back to your own organisations, if you know an auditor is coming into your site next week, what happens this week? Yeah. And in many, many instances, what happens is we do our best to try and hide things from the auditor. So we're not in that culture of finding the gaps. And that's what auditing's trying to do, finding the gaps, the things that we don't do properly or could do better. So we need to be in this continuous improvement mode to help make it happen. Okay. But just moving on from there, you know, what do we need to do then in terms of managing it? Once we've got this vision, once the business has set down what it wants to achieve, how do we actually do it? And this is down to your process safety management system, really. And really, I can sum up process safety management in these three simple questions, really, which are topped by having the leadership, because of course none of this happens if the leadership aren't interested and they don't set things up to happen. But we need to understand these three questions. Do we know what can go wrong on our sites? And it's all right, you know, we can sit in a hazard or a HAZOP and the team can come across, well, if this happens, we can have a fire. That's fine. But if we're talking about significant events, we're talking about big fires. Does it go off site? What harm could it actually do? We need to know an awful lot of detail around what could go wrong. And then the second question we need to know is, what have we got within the business to prevent these things from going wrong? And then, so these are our protective measures, things that we've built into our designs, things that we've built into the way in which we operate and maintain our facilities to prevent these things via protective measures. Okay. And then we need to know, how do we know that these protective measures are going to be effective, that they are going to prevent this big disaster? Yeah. So this is turning round to make this job easier. We need to get focused on criticality, the big things in the business that can harm us. What have we got to prevent these? And how do we know that those preventative means are going to work on the day? Because ideally, you know, many of the bells and whistles that we'll build into our designs on plant to prevent, control or mitigate these fires and toxic releases and things, ideally they should never operate. So they're sitting there for the time when the very, very odd occasion where they need to operate, and we need to know that they're going to be effective. So our process safety management system needs to be able to answer these three questions in an appropriate depth. And if you've got large inventories of dangerous substances that can result in large fires, explosions, toxic gas releases, pressure bursts, chemical runaways and decompositions and things, we need to fully understand them and know what we've got there to protect ourselves against the impact of that. So just to put a bit more meat on that, the bones of what we need to do for that first question, do we understand what can go wrong? This is essentially down to our hazard identification exercises and our risk assessments. Okay. And as I say, we need to know that in detail. So it's all right knowing we've got a fire or a toxic gas release. We need to know what's called the extent and severity. How far does that toxic plume go? What harm does it do? Does it result in people coughing a bit, or does it kill multiple people, for example? So it may take us into the world of having to do consequence modelling and dispersion modelling and all this sort of stuff. And once we really understand our processes, you know, we need to keep that knowledge within the business. We need to use that knowledge and keep it within the business all the time, not just in one or two people's heads who have done these studies and what have you, but the impact of it within the business. Once we fully understand that, when we've done our hazard identification and risk assessment procedures, we will have determined what measures are installed or are present within the business to prevent, control, and mitigate those things from going wrong. It's all around reducing the likelihood of these events from happening. So you'll have things that prevent the release of a toxic material or control that release or deal with that release once it's out there. Okay, and this is where the management system comes in, where the process safety management system comes in, is to make sure that these items of equipment or these tasks that we employ to prevent, control, or mitigate these major hazards have been properly designed, have been properly constructed, have been properly installed, are properly operated, are properly inspected, are properly maintained, and so on. It's what's known as the process safety life cycle. So throughout the whole life, it needs to be able to cope with all these different phases. Because, you know, if we design the wrong piece of equipment because the materials of construction are incorrect, then the asset might fall apart and dump 50 tons of chlorine on the floor, for instance. If we don't operate it correctly and we let it go over pressure, so we then vent it out, so we're then controlling the hazard, but we're still having this loss of containment. And then we've got to deal with that once it's out. Okay. And then the things that we have to do to know these, so these protective measures that which ideally should never operate, we need to know, are they going to be effective? It's about really how the organization learns and improves. So it's around the standard good best management practices of measuring performance, having some metrics, what's known as key performance indicators, key process safety performance indicators, really investigating any incidents or near misses that we have or may have, and audits and management review. Okay, all trying to make sure to give us that comfort that yes, we've got this item on a piece of equipment that's really critical to us, because this should prevent one of these actions, but it'll only prevent it if on the day it works. And this is where the management system and making sure that they are the appropriate items of equipment and so on come into play. So that's what we're trying to do. And really, you know, what I'm talking about, just as with any management system, it's down to your policies and your procedures. And in many respects, creating all of that paperwork is the most relatively straightforward thing. Yeah, it's linking it all together. It's trying to stop it just being hidden within certain silos. You know, the mechanical engineers are only interested in the mechanical engineering aspects. The electrical engineers are only interested in how's it all fit together. Okay, and then we need to make sure that once we've written down these policies and procedures, they're implemented well. I can't tell you the number of times I've been on site and I ask people, what's the procedure say? And often it takes them quite a while to actually find the procedure itself, because these days with our digital systems, we have quite a large management system and it can take quite a while to find a particular procedure. And then when we pull the procedure up during an audit or something, I'll generally find somebody says, oh, I didn't know it said that. Yeah, they need to be understood and used. Yeah, and they need to be workable. It's all right putting words of motherhood and apple pie down. They need to be workable. The staff need to be able to use these procedures, otherwise they won't. Okay, it's as simple as that. So, you know, we need to set that direction, which is part of the policies, what the business is, and then the procedures. And I'll come to this in a little bit, in a little shorter time. Now, There are already frameworks out there that can help you develop your management system for process safety. The major one in the States is the CCPS guidelines issued by the American Institute of Chemical Engineers. In the UK, there's the UK Energy Institute guidelines. There's also OSHA PSM standards, and you'll find that they're all pretty similar. They're built around what are called pillars or focus areas or words like that, containing elements. And as illustrated on this side, the CCPS has got 4 pillars and 20 elements. The UK Energy Institute's got 4 focus areas and 18 elements. The OSHA PSM standard's got 14 elements. What you find if you delve into all of these, all they've done is they've combined some elements which other frameworks have separated out. But just to give you a flavour of what's in these frameworks, if I look at the CCPS, the first pillar is around leadership and culture, okay, with these 5 elements: setting up that culture, compliance with the law and standards as a starting point, organisational competence, that the business itself is capable of preventing, controlling and mitigating these events, which of course is of interest. It requires all our workforce to be engaged in this topic, and of course our stakeholders, whether that's the regulators, our clients, the public that live around our sites, they're also engaged as well. So there's the leadership culture aspect. The second pillar is around understanding our hazards and risk and keeping that knowledge within the business. The third pillar is around managing risk, and it's got the things, when you look at all of these headings, you'll think, well, this is no different to an occupational health and safety management system. I can go to the shops, I can go to the British Standards Institute, and I can buy a document that tells me how to build an occupational health and safety management system, and it'll have all of these different means of managing risk. It'll tell you that you need to have operating procedures, safe working practices like permits to work and things like that, that you need to look after the integrity of your assets so they don't get too rusty or they don't break. You need to manage your contractors, the training and performance and the competence of your individuals on site, management of change, operational readiness, conduct of operations, emergency management. Yeah. But from a process safety point of view, it's a lot more specific. It's down to not just looking at slips, trips and falls, it's down to preventing, controlling and mitigating our potential major accident hazards. And then the fourth pillar is around learning from experience. Yeah, which is around how do we learn from any incidents or near misses that you as a business have, or other people outside of your business have, other people in your process sector and so on, for example. What can you learn from incidents that they've had? Around how you measure your performance and your metrics, audit, management review and continuous improvement. Okay, so they're all very much linked. It's very similar, but there's a different focus, and it's this focus to preventing, controlling and mitigating these very rare but could be very large consequence events. And the Energy Institute, just the same. It's got its 4 focus areas rather than pillars, and just slightly different words, but they effectively mean exactly the same thing. They've combined a couple of elements into one, so they only have 18 elements under these 4 areas rather than 20, but effectively they're the same. And it's the way we've been managing process safety for years and years from a framework point of view. Okay. But we're talking about the strategy. We're talking about writing down what we want to achieve, our policies and procedures. Okay. So for every one of these elements within the process safety management system, we ought to have a policy, that sets down the strategy for what the business is trying to achieve within this specific element. And it sets a standard that the business wants. And of course, that standard needs to comply with any local legislation, but also primarily needs to protect the business. So yes, you'll have to comply with legislation. You may do more as a business to protect your business. Okay. But when we're writing policies and differentiating them from procedures, I always take the view when I'm writing a policy of what I call the 5 W's. What, where, who, when, and why. You know, what is the scope of this policy? Where does it apply? Who does it apply to? Who's got responsibility? When does it apply? When do we apply this thing? And importantly, why? So people, when they read the policy, can understand what it's trying to achieve, their role in it, where it applies on their site, and so on and so forth. Yeah, which is different to the procedures that you'll have, which procedures generally tell you how to do something. Yeah, so for example, you might have a procedure for carrying out HAZOPs. So it's how to carry out a HAZOP. You'll have a procedure for that. How are you going to assess competence? How are you going to determine that your vessels are fit for purpose in an asset integrity management system? So there'll be lots of procedures as well under each one of the policies. But it's your policy that will determine, when will you carry out a HAZOP? How often will you carry out a HAZOPs? Which assets will you carry out HAZOPs on, and when in the process cycle, and so on and so forth. It's your policy that sets that strategy, if you like, but then how you actually do it will be down in your procedures. If you're good at this, there is a management almost philosophy around what's called high reliability organizations, which is aimed at businesses, organizations where there is a high level of residual hazard. There's the potential to do a lot of harm. And the idea is that if we've got mindful leadership, so this is more than just leadership, this is leadership that doesn't fall into the trap of believing that we can leave this to the technical people to sort this out for us. And anyway, it's so unlikely that this big event will happen, I'm not going to give it much attention. Mindful leaders keep it at the front of their mind that what they're playing with in their business, the level of hazards they've got within their business, can do an awful lot of harm, and we don't want it to happen. Yeah, it's very much like the lottery in the UK. What we're trying to do in process safety is not win that jackpot each week. Yeah. Now the jackpot is a large amount of money, so it's a serious consequence if you win the jackpot. It's life changing. Rather than go to work, we can go and sail our yacht round the Bahamas or whatever. But the likelihood of winning that jackpot each week, it used to be about 1 in 14 million per year. Now, what's that mean? So we can bandy these figures around, and your risk assessors in the business and that'll bandy these figures around. What's 1 in 14 million mean? Well, in the UK, if you're a male over 40 and you buy your lottery ticket at noon on Saturday, then you're actually more likely to have died from a heart attack by the time the draw is pulled at 8 p.m. on Saturday evening than you are of winning that jackpot. Yeah, so it is a very unlikely thing to win. But what we're trying to do here in process safety in turn is not win that jackpot. And the way we do that is this definition of really understanding what it is that we're playing with, and looking for as much information as we can get, feeding that into getting all that information, because we're a learning organization, to make improvements. That should allow us then to anticipate problems, anticipate the bad things that could happen, and put in place measures to try and prevent, control, and mitigate them proactively. So we don't just fix things when something's gone wrong. We're actively fixing things before they go wrong. That will allow us that the event itself isn't going to be as bad, because there should be less and less unexpected events. You're still going to have your unknown unknowns and these sorts of things, but you should be able to contain these unexpected events a lot better. And if we couple that with that just culture, so that people understand and are accountable for doing the right thing, then we've got this high reliability organization. The chances are that we're managing it appropriately and constantly seeking to improve to make it better. And one way of doing this that I've done in the past with businesses, and especially with global businesses, so often global businesses, when you've got sites all over the world and they've all got to comply with their own individual local legislation. But very often businesses, leaders in these types of businesses get very concerned and worried, because that's the end point for many of their sites, is complying with their local legislation. And that can differ across the world, from either no local legislation at all up to very extensive legislation that requires a lot of input. So in Europe and the UK, if you've got potential major accident hazards, the legislation is pretty darn tough to comply with. But what in these situations, what this chart is illustrating is that across the top we've got our 20 elements, and that sets where the business itself, the company itself, has set its own process safety strategy for each of those elements, what the business expects to see. Okay, and then as we go down to each site, they will then adapt, if necessary, those standards that the business has set to make sure that they also comply with their local legislation if it's present, because obviously that would be one of the concerns for the site. And then they'll have their own specific procedures for the tasks and operations and so on that they'll do. Okay, so it's sort of a layered approach. And then when we come to carrying out metrics and things, the metrics for an individual site will be down to the issues, the gaps, essentially, that have been found, and the hazards that are particularly inherent within their own processes in their own sites. They'll focus on that, but we'll also have top of the shop indicators. So those indicators from all the sites will feed up to assure the leaders that, yes, everybody's looking after their assets, or everybody's appropriately managed for emergency management and these sorts of things. Okay, and it's the same, and the same thing can be done for audits. So when a group corporate auditor comes to site, he'll be auditing the sites against the company set, the corporate policies. Yeah, whereas the site themselves will be auditing their sites against their own modified policy that takes account of any additional site-specific things that the group policy doesn't, or legislative requirements that are above and beyond what the corporate policies require. And this has worked quite well in a number of global organisations that I've worked with on the past doing this. But it's like everything else, if the leadership changes, if that commitment changes, these things can crumble extremely rapidly. Okay, it only needs a change of leadership at the top that isn't interested in this topic, sees it as a bureaucratic exercise, and the whole business will start not following its own rules or diluting its rules. So I hope you've found this seminar useful. Needless to say, if you are already on this journey of improving or setting up and developing your process safety management systems and strategies, policies and procedures, we're here if you need any help. We've got experience of setting these things up. We've seen how we can measure culture and all of these sorts of things, so we can give you tips and tricks and point you in the right direction, and we'd love to help you on your journey and try and make this continuous improvement as good as it can be. So at that, I will stop. Thank you very much for listening. I hope you found it interesting and enjoyable for the past 45-50 minutes. If you'd like to ask us any questions or make any comments, please email us to info@Sigma-HSE or give us a call, and we'll happily come and discuss things with you and see if we can help you on your process safety journey. So on that, I'll say goodbye and thank you very much, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.